That was cute. That was just plain adorable. Of course, everything she does is adorable. See, that's the difference between living in the house and living outside the house. Yeah, everything is adorable, but when you're living there, it's like, yeah. Speaking of which, so Tuesday, a week ago Tuesday, my mom went and had her hearing test, and they ordered hearing aids for her. And so then Tuesday, a family member has to go with her and help her with getting fitted with her hearing aids. And it was amazing. You know, we've known for years that her hearing was gone. Now keep in mind, we knew there was a difference because my mom never has listened. I mean, we've had people, we have screamed at her on the phone to stop talking so she can listen to what somebody else is saying. I had a nurse or a receptionist at one of the doctor's offices tell me, I tried to talk to her and she wouldn't stop talking. Yeah, there was one time she called here on a Wednesday night and she's just chattering away. I forget who answered the phone, and it's Wednesday night and they come and get me and they say, Rick, your mom's on the phone, and they go back and she's still talking to the same person on the phone. You know, she never has listened. But losing her hearing is different. You know, we knew there was a difference, she just couldn't hear. And so she goes and she gets the hearing aids, and it was dramatic. I mean, it was phenomenal to see. She suddenly realizes how bad her hearing had become, almost to the point she almost cries. And one of my cousins, and I put it on Facebook, and one of my cousins said the same sort of thing. He said, yeah, I just got mine, and I knew that it was bad, but I didn't realize it was that bad. I almost cried. And so we're on the way home, we're talking about it, and then we get home, and first thing she does is go in her room, she turns on her TV, and it doesn't take long for the TV volume to come down. I mean, it goes way down. And so I said to her, you know, she says, everything's so loud, it's like you're shouting at me. And I said, no, I'm trying to talk softer to you. I've been shouting at you. And I said, your TV is an appropriate volume. Your TV was so loud, we could hear it all through the house. We could hear it behind closed doors in the other end of the building with doors closed and over every other TV in the house. I mean, it was that bad. She said, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And so dramatic. Now, that was Tuesday. For those of you who have been through this with other parents, guess what happened come Friday? I take her to Walmart. You know, that's her big deal each week, is to go to Walmart. So I take her to Walmart, and I had noticed progressively the TV was coming up in volume. So she's learned how to turn the volume down on the hearing aids. While she's sitting there, I said, see, I knew it. You've turned down the volume on your hearing aids. You're almost back to where you were before you got the hearing aids. She says, no, I'm not wearing them right now because I'm going to get my hair done. And you know, don't get your hair wet. So what starts? The excuse to not wear them. She told Suzanne that these were only her temporary hearing aids until she gets her real ones. No, these are her real hearing aids. So Tuesday is the follow-up. This is what will likely happen. There's a couple of possibilities. One is she'll go on, she'll pay for these, she'll have 30 days. That's only a possibility. Number two, just as likely, if not greater likelihood, is she'll come up with some sort of excuse. Oh, they're too expensive, or it's too loud, everybody's shouting, or I don't like them, or they don't fit, or I didn't know these were the ones. You know, there will be an excuse. You know, and I think that's a great example of us as human beings, that we can get so used to what's wrong that it becomes our normal. And despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, we will return to what is dysfunctional because it's what we've grown accustomed to. Do you hear me? Now I want you to keep that story in mind, because that's what happened in Corinth. You know, we're taking a little sidetrack right now in our study of Romans, as we're studying about the church. We're talking about the giftedness of the church, and the church is how it's supposed to operate, each part, each component operating together. Now keep in mind, when Paul wrote to Corinth, the very first thing, one of the first things he addresses in this letter, and it's now 12 chapters later, one of the very first things he had addressed was their disunity within the church. There was backbiting. There were folks who were lining up on sides. It was like a playground fight. You know, it was bad. There were people who probably had gotten to the point, if you've ever been through a church split, there were probably people who literally hated their brother or sister in Christ. And, you know, if we truly are, as I said with my story about Mom's hearing aid, if we are truly so accustomed to dysfunction that we return to it after overwhelming evidence, that's a problem when it comes to the church. For 2,000 years, we have had the letter to Corinth, and yet the same problems still arise. Does that say we're a little like my mom and her hearing aids? That despite overwhelming evidence, we don't get the lesson, even though we've had proof for 2,000 years it exists. Our problem is, whatever excuse we come up with as to why I don't operate this way. So let's go ahead and turn to 1 Corinthians 12. We're going to start at verse 12. And I'm trying something a little new this morning. As I told you, I'm finally using my Bible program to its fullness. And so I'm doing it with notes rather than my Kindle. And we'll see how things go. I've been using my Kindle for years. Verses 12 and 13. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body. Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit. Now, I have to tell you, Paul's imagery of the Bible is unique to Paul. No one else used this imagery. And he uses it more than just here in 1 Corinthians. He talks about the church as a body quite a bit. And so what's he trying to say? Look, it's real simple. This one's a simple one to get. So if you're following along with your notes, you can fill in the blanks, and that is we belong to each other. Hey, that's a pretty simple precept, isn't it? However, just how deep is our problem as human beings in getting principles like this? For those of us who have children and grandchildren, especially for those, let's see, how old is Katie? 5. Perfect age. That's the age. Do you remember that age with your children or grandchildren? You know how it goes? I can do it. I can do it myself, right? 5-year-old, independent. I mean, they are so convinced just how good they are at doing stuff. I don't need you. Who's going to drive you to the doctor? Who's going to get your food for you? Who's going to cook all that? So why? Because in their limited understanding, everything exists. They don't really think about those sort of consequences, but they do know one thing. I'm big now, right? I'm big now. Is Katie big now? Yeah. And so they say things like, I can do this. The problem in the church is we have the same sort of attitude a lot of times. I can do this. Or what's worse is, I don't need you. Or what's even worse is, I don't need you because you are inferior. Now, we don't say it like that, do we? Well, you know, so-and-so just doesn't do it right. You know, I could do it so much better. Doesn't that sound like a 5-year-old? But why does it come out of a 65-year-old? Crazy, isn't it? So that's principle number one, is we belong to each other, but we are also one body. And this is not new imagery for Paul either. This gets reinforced over and over and over again in the New Testament. And there's no Jew, there's no Greek, there's no male, there's no female, there's no black, there's no white, there's no green, there's no yellow. We are one. We are united by one Christ, one Lord, one baptism, one faith. Period. One. And so he reinforces that here. See it again? Verses 12 and 13. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit. So we not only belong to each other, but we are one body. But as it's up there, the lesson has to go on. Verse 14. For the body does not consist of one member, but many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. Now he's being silly, isn't he? He's using this sort of imagery. When does your foot cry out? I don't know. Mine does, especially when I'm on the ladder working in Mom's apartment. You know, I come down off of that ladder and my feet are screaming, hey, you're not supposed to put that much weight on that smallest little strip of your foot. Scream! Right? But it's not the same as the foot just packing up its bags one day and taking off and saying, I'm out of here. And Paul's using that sort of imagery. How often does that happen to your body? You can't do that here. Why did he have to say that? Because in Corinth it was happening. In Corinth, the disunity was so bad that what people were saying to each other, I don't need you. Or it's obvious you don't need me. And by the way, was that only true 2,000 years ago? Have you seen that in churches? I have, all too often. Where people say, I don't need you. Or I've come to the conclusion, based on the way you treat me, you don't need me. Verse 16, and if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. We belong to each other because we share the same baptism. So he has gone out of his way to talk about how we are one body, we are baptized into one faith, and then he uses all this imagery to share with us or reinforce for us that idea of baptism. Why baptism? One of the things we forget in our baptism, and a lot of times in our communion, in our Lord's Supper, is we forget that we're supposed to leave everything in the past. We join something new. And we commit to Christ to be his for his purpose. Remember what Paul just said here? God designed this body. Which is another kind of polite way of saying, you don't get a choice. One of the greatest ills in the church in America, and I think one of the reasons why we can point to ourselves and say, here's some stuff we do really well, but man, there's a lot we don't do very well, particularly when we compare ourselves to other countries, is this. It's this idea that the church is democracy. That we've taken democratic principles, and by the way, historically, you can trace it back. You can go back to post-World War II. The folks who fought in World War II came back, and they fought for what in World War II? Freedom They fought for democracy. They fought to free the world. And so those principles, which had been driven into everybody, I mean, you didn't have to fight in the war in order to get into that identity, because what were the people doing here in the United States? They were rationing. All of a sudden, I don't know who qualifies in this age. Oleo? How many remember oleo before margarine? And what did you have to do with the oleo? Yeah, you had to put the color in it. You had to make it yellow so it looked, I don't know, was it that to make it look tasty, or was that I don't know. I mean, so you couldn't get butter, because what were they doing with the butter? They're sending it off to the troops. They were rationing gas. There were different levels. You had to have a sticker on your car that told how much gas you could get in a week, So everybody here was caught up in it. Why were we doing it? We were doing it to protect democracy, because here's Hitler and here's the Axis powers, and what are they doing? They're trying to remove freedom from the rest of the world. So then the war's over. Evil has been defeated. And these soldiers come back, and these people come back, and they settle in their churches. And they start to grow up a little bit. But why? Because most of the kids that went over were kids. And you come back, and you're really an adult. I mean, you've seen people's heads blown off. And you start to get active in church, particularly after things horrific as war. And it brings you actually in some weird ways closer to God. And then they start to sit in church and they say, we need democracy in church. And I'm asking you, where is that in the Bible? I mean, it's not. There's not a good track record for democracy in the Bible. The people said, we want a golden calf. So that was democracy, and they voted and they got a golden calf. What happened next? God was not happy. No. Right? They voted, we want a king like the foreign peoples we've got. Guess what happened? They got a king. Poor Samuel, who's the last of the judges, which, by the way, a judge merely represented the king, who was God, the theocracy. God was the one who was supposed to be running it. And so God says, okay, I'm going to give them what they want. Now, how do we know he does that? Romans 1 and 2. What did it say? Man sinned, and God gave them what they wanted. He turned them over to their sin and let them run around, just so you can see how bad it is on your own. And so the Jews got a king. Did that go well? No. And it goes on and on and on. By the way, in the New Testament, how did they choose the deacons? How did they choose? Oh, well, for example, there were two names that were put up for apostle to replace Judas. How did they choose? They cast lots. Why? Because throwing some dice, you let God, you trust God enough to make the dice land where he wants them to land. And that's how much trust they had, not in democracy, not in the vote, but that God can control things. And it's the same sort of thing here in the church. There were so many people in Corinth who were saying, I want it my way, I want it my way, I want it my way. They would band together and they say, see, there's a whole bunch of us that have this same sort of voice. We want it our way. But there would be one group over here who wanted it one way, and there'd be another group over here who wanted it their way, and there'd be another group over there who wanted it yet another way. And Paul is saying, here's this beautiful imagery of a human body, and we can learn something about the church from that. God created the human body, but he also created the body of Christ. And it's supposed to work together in harmony. How much so? Let's read what happens next. So we not only share this baptism, we are baptized into an identity. We are baptized into faith. We are baptized into salvation. We are baptized, it just goes on. But verse 21, the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. Here's your clue to the next blank. nor can the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. That he's being really polite, because in his day, he would not have brought up some of those parts of our body who are not pretty. We keep those covered up most of the time, just so you know. And so he's saying those less honorable parts, you still need those, don't you? I mean, we don't like them. Especially the older we get, you know, gravity starts to shift on things, and it's not fun, is it? When you look in the mirror. I try and avoid the mirror as much as I can. But here's Paul, and he's saying, hey, wait. Those parts that are weaker, those disturbing parts of the human body, those are indispensable, aren't they? And there are parts of the body of Christ that just don't seem to fulfill a function. I would say if you're having a ministry meeting in a church, there's always some group that tends to get the short end of the stick on the likability factor. You know, the weaker ministries. As a preacher, I would pick finance. Now, years ago, when I was executive minister and I was in charge of finances, I would have said we're important. You better listen to me. I'm telling you, this is the way we're going. If we don't solve this problem, we're up the creek, you know, that sort of thing. And that's all Paul's saying is, we need each other. And on those parts of the body, verse 23, what we think less honorable, we bestow the greater honor, and our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. It's one of your 50 plus one another passages in the New Testament. We need each other. Verse 26. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. I have to tell you, this past Easter, we didn't suffer in the same way you two did. But we suffered. And we're still suffering. And you're still suffering. I mean, that's part of both the tragedy of human interaction, but also the beauty of how Christ brings us together. Because Bonnie, Liz, I need you. And I'm sure you found out at that time you needed us. You know, we all have those moments, don't we? So we all suffer together. We need each other. So if one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. Now you are the body of Christ and individually members of it. He's just reminding again. He's talking unity, 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 unity. You know, he's like beating this drum. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, helping, administrating, and various kinds of tongues. I need to tell you about verse 28. There's a lot of debate about verse 28 because he seems to be contradicting himself. He's telling us that there is no hierarchy in the church, that there's no one is better than the other. And then he says something right here. Notice what he says very first there in verse 28. He says, God has appointed in the church first apostles. Is he destroying his own argument? No. No, he's just saying, remember, also in chapter 12, he just got finished with last week's passage that we read. He got finished with a list of gifts, spiritual gifts. Now he's talking parts of the body. And God did start first with apostles. That's how it all got started. And then prophets. Prophets, by the way, is not just, hey, you know, tomorrow there's going to be a spaceship that lands out here in the parking lot of the church. No, that's not that sort of prophecy. It's what I'm telling you today can be considered prophecy. In that, if you have somebody speaking for God, and they're saying, if you're doing this, you're going to suffer for it, that's a form of prophecy. It's preaching. It's compelling us or trying to convince us that we need to make a change in our behavior. That's prophets, and prophets still work today, both ways, I believe. So are all apostles? No. Are all prophets? No. Are all teachers? No. I'm adding this in. Do all work miracles? Do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But earnestly desire the higher gifts. Now, by the way, I've kind of avoided it up to this point. But he's very much talking about tongues, which is one of the major issues within the Church of Corinth. It was splitting the church. I told the story last week that when I was in college, my first year of college, that I had a Pentecostal minister tell our college at chapel that we weren't saved unless we spoke in tongues. And that really just alienated me against Pentecostal charismatic sort of movements for the longest time because of one person. The problem wasn't the gift. The problem was how people misuse the gift, and that's what Paul's talking about here. The problem is not tongues. The problem is not miracles. The problem is not healing. The problem is when people misuse those gifts. The problem is when people have the wrong attitudes about those gifts. And he says, but earnestly, verse 31, desire the higher gifts. And notice it's almost like it's on a separate line. And it says, and I will show you still a more excellent way. Hold on to that for just a second. But our third point here is we impact each other. The body of Christ is meant to go together, but one of the most important things we need to remember is every decision we make impacts everyone else. If you make a bad decision, it's going to impact others badly. If you make a good decision, it's going to impact others in a good way. But notice what he says next, and we'll wrap this up. He gives an answer to this whole issue of the misuse of spiritual gifts and the division within that church about tongues. But notice, I think his answer answers every problem in the church, particularly in regards to disunity. So it's not just about tongues here. Notice what he says. A whole chapter dedicated to it, and we call it the chapter of love. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Just noise. And you can be erudite, you can be intellectual, you can be well educated. I mean, you can have it all going for you. You can deliver a fantastic sermon or a fantastic speech. But if love isn't there, you're just noise. And if I have prophetic power, so I understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. So love is essential to the body. Now, before we go any further, I need to tell you back to the story about Mom and her hearing aids. I had prepared for Tuesday to get to the hearing aid office and have her say, I don't need them. You know, and has anybody who's been with a loved one who has hearing, you've been through there? You know, or what's worse yet, you spend $3,000 on the hearing aids, and guess what happens to them? They end up in a drawer in the bedroom and never get used, right? Yeah, or lost. Yeah, lost. Sometimes lost, but then sometimes lost. You know, one of those things. to return to dysfunction because that's what we become what we're used to. By the way, that is the principle behind why I say, remember in Scripture how often it tells us that God thunders. Job 38 is great. For out of the thundercloud, God spoke. I love that. Who is this that darkens my counsel? I love that chapter. I love it. I mean, I just imagine these guys sitting around and poor Job, and he's scraping off his boils with pot shards, and he's throwing dust on his head, and he's just feeling pretty miserable, and life is horrible, and there's his friends who are giving really bad advice, and all of a sudden, boom! Hey! Who is this that darkens my counsel? You see how that goes? Satan whispers. Notice in the midst of this, Paul doesn't blame Satan. We do today. Man, we put all kinds of things on Satan. As a matter of fact, we made Satan like 40 feet tall, and he's able to jump massive buildings and faster than a locomotive and all this stuff. And now I want to tell you, Satan is puny. He's weeny. He is without power. He is not omniscient. He is not omnipresent. He cannot do what God does, but a lot of times we tend to put him in that category. So Paul here doesn't blame any of this on Satan, but he does say in other passages, for example, also here in 1 Corinthians, he says, do not give Satan a toehold. Why? Because Satan whispers. That's all his power is whisper. But because we're human and we're so used to operating in Satan's territory and not God's, guess what happens to God's thunder? We drown it out to a whisper. And Satan's whispers, we magnify to thunder. And so we return to bad behavior. Now with that in mind, here's what love does not do. Love does not compare. I'm better than you, or boy, they just can't cook like so-and-so does, or those sort of things. You don't compare one way or the other, up or down. Why? Because the gift that the other person has is the gift from God, and it's designed by God for them and for the church as a whole. We need to be happy with that. And when we compare, guess what happens? Just what Paul talked about at the beginning of 1 Corinthians. When you compare, well, I'm with Apollos. No, I'm really with Paul because he's better, he's cooler. And remember, Paul got a little bit upset at that. Don't compare. 2, love does not consider others dispensable. Do you realize that's one of the biggest problems with staffing in a church in the United States is we throw away ministers like it's nothing. We get rid of staff people like it's nothing. Finally, in the church, a good thing, but also a bad thing has happened. We now have headhunters for staff. If you're willing to spend $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 as a church, you can hire a new minister. You're just paying somebody else to do all the groundwork for you.